These are the most common mistakes that we see guys making when they purchase a short block from us or from one of our competitors. And the number one is cleanliness. So when you guys purchase a short block, you want to make sure that it stays bagged up. We see this when we've sold short blocks to customers. They feel they get it in over their heads, and let's say they bring the short block back to us and we get it and it's just covered with dust and light coating of dirt. The grease that we use to assemble these engines, you can see all dirt all stuck to it. This tells us that it hasn't been covered when it's been in their possession. So it means we need to take it all apart, wash it, and put it back together. That's going to waste a bunch of time, waste a bunch of their money. So when you guys are at home, that's the number one thing. Let's make sure that we get the stuff bagged up, keep it clean. I don't recommend doing this with an open garage door out to the outside. There's going to be a lot of stuff blowing around in the air. So that would be number one. Second, here, when you're doing the covers, you'll make sure that you brake clean all your covers, blow it out with compressed air. This tray in here, you want to make sure you remove that, hit that with all brake clean, get in there with your fingers, make sure nothing's stuck in any of the corners. So that would be one of the biggest things that we see. The second thing is when you install your camshaft, obviously make sure that things are lubricated properly, and we want to make sure it spins smooth, no binding. If this binds at all, that's going to be a bad time. You're going to end up ripping up a cam bearing. Things aren't going to go right. So if it does bind, you will need to have that journal polished until you get that smooth result. So that's really, really important. After this, I am going to let our head assembler, Adam Golan, show you his procedure for installing the gear as well as the oil pump. One of the main things that we've seen over the years is if guys aren't putting red Loctite on their cam bolts, we've seen those back out. So he's got a great procedure for getting this done and not having any problems. So I'll let him explain that to you now.
So today we're going to install our Cloy's Hex Adjust timing set. This is the timing set that we predominantly use on every single LS engine. This is the one we recommend just because of the adjustability, the strength of the chain, as Chad talked about before. So with our Hex Adjust setup here, first thing we want to do is take it out of the box and clean it. It does have some little bit of cardboard on it every once in a while. So it has this bearing in the back. We want to make sure, see it has two sides here. We got a silver side and a black side. The black side we want facing the actual thrust plate here. One trick that we like to do is we put a little grease and this holds the bearing on. If you do not do this, you have a chance of it falling out. It'll fall on the ground, it's dirty, you gotta clean it. So we try to avoid that. So what we're gonna do is the crank gear, we have the dot facing down, and then of course the engine's upside down right now. And then we're gonna have the cam gear dot facing up. So we're gonna take our chain here. We're gonna we wanna make sure there's a little bit of lube on this because this is one of the last items that actually sees lubrication. So you can take pretty much any oil that you have, just rub it in to the chain. So what we're gonna do, like we said before, so we're gonna have the dot facing up. So get your chain installed. We already got this facing down, this guy's facing up. So we just come in here, we try to line it up as best as possible. So now we have these two aligned. Now, this is a tip. Leave the rear cover off when you're installing this. A lot of times when you're going to put this timing set on or you're screwing the bolts in, you push the cam back. It's kind of a nightmare. So just put your hand on the back side of the camshaft here and just slowly work this guy on. All right, so now we're good there. So since it does have the hex adjust and there's adjustability, we want to install this one straight up on 0. So we confirm that this is lined up. We got our 1/4 inch Allen key here, and we want to go to the center little mark right here. And that means that everything here is 0. One thing that we don't do is we don't use the stock bolts. Those are installed at like 20 foot-pounds, no red Loctite. If you do that on this engine, they're gonna back out. So we actually have some aftermarket bolts here that we put red Loctite on. So we're gonna screw these guys in. Grab my speed handle. Like I said, Sometimes when you screw these guys in, the cam will move backwards. So keep a hand on the back of the camshaft. Screw them down. We're only going pretty much hand tight because we still want to confirm that our dot is lined up. So our dot's at 0. Now we're going to want to torque these at 30 foot-pounds. For the guys that have the stock crank, you can use the stock bolt as your turner. We have this handy dandy tool here that actually makes our life a lot easier. Just put it in the opposite direction of your torque. We're set at 30. You want to go through, do each of these once. Then we want to go back. Always double check your torque specs, always. This is a failure point. If these back out, they'll go into the cam sensor, the engine won't run right, and you'll have big issues. We're gonna be installing our Melling 10296 high volume oil pump here. So I've already gone ahead and lubed this up. But if you're at home, you take this guy out of the box, we always recommend that you use oil, and we wanna spray it down this hole here, and then just go ahead, spray a little bit, spin it over. You can actually hear it right now, there's lubrication in there. Another thing we're gonna wanna do is put a little lubrication on the crank gear as well. These are some of the last components that see oil. So we wanna make sure that they're gonna go together smooth. So when we go to install it, this guy's gonna be a little loose. All we're gonna do is line up all these teeth to make sure. You just gotta get your finger in there a little bit. You can wiggle it around. We're not bolted up, so we can do this. Just wiggle it on, get it, make sure it's flush, make sure it spins. So we're gonna take our bolts here, use red Loctite again, because there is a lot of movement going on. We wanna make sure this guy stays exactly where it's supposed to be. Put our red Loctite. This is gonna be similar torque to like where you do your cover. We're gonna do 20 foot-pounds. But first off, we're gonna go we'll go speed handle tight. And the reason being, we don't want to torque that up until we know there's at least a little bit of space in between the gears. So we're going to take our tool here. Again, you can use your stock crank bolt. Just give it a full rotation. Take this off. Grab we like to use a 1.5 thou feeler gauge. Just want to go in here. We want to confirm there's a little space in between those gears. We're looking good there. We got our torque wrench set at 20. Again, when you torque these, it takes literally no time to go back through. One thing too, before we go put our pickup tube on, we like to use 105 grease here. We fill up this point. This helps when the engine goes to start and to pull all the oil out of the oil pan. So that's how we install our oil pump.
Okay, so next we are looking at the windage tray here. So windage tray, when you are installing this, you're just gonna wanna drop this on loose. Any of you guys that are doing a stroker that has a 4-inch stroke, this is gonna be super important. Stock stroke guys, not so much, because typically the connecting rod bolts will not hit the windage tray. But guys that are doing stroker, it's guaranteed to hit. So what you're gonna wanna do is drop that on loose, and you're gonna wanna turn this over and just look under there. Make sure that it doesn't hit. In this case, this is a stock stroke, so nothing hits, and I can see all the way through when that bolt comes up. I got a ton of clearance there. If you had a 4-inch stroke, you're gonna notice this is gonna go da-dunk, da-dunk, it's gonna hit up, so it's gonna require you to put a washer in there. So you'll just put washers in all of the positions, put it back on, retest to make sure it doesn't hit. Also, when you're looking in there, make sure that you have enough clearance. Just because it doesn't move doesn't mean that it might not be super close and hit it when the engine is at full RPM. So just make sure you got enough clearance there. Next move, just for the sake of the video, we're just going to be quick here and throw a few nuts on. We're going to show you the installation of the pickup tube and how to check the pickup tube clearance here. This is super important to get this done to ensure that you've got enough room between the bottom of the oil pan and the pickup tube. So that way, because if it's too close to the bottom of the pan, you're not going to pick up oil. So at full RPM, you could be starving the pump for oil. If you are in a stroker situation where you put the washers in place, and remember, if you put a washer and that jacks the windage tray up, that moves the pickup tube closer to the bottom of the pan. So this next procedure will be super important, for you to pay attention to. Melling, when we use these melon pumps, this is the two O-rings they come with. So these two O-rings, one's thicker, one's thinner. For the sake of this video, we're using the popular Holley swap pan. This pickup tube will use the black O-ring. We just like to lubricate that up a little bit with some oil. You'll stick that right on there, work that right in to the point where we're in. Yep, so now you can see that's all set flush down. We'll take two screws here, bolt this down real quick like. Usually put a little blue Loctite on this, but again, for the sake of the video, let's try to speed things up, get the point across. So then we'll take and we'll put this nut on. Okay, so now that's all seated in position. So we've got the O-ring in there, everything's seated in position. Now we put a little bit of tape over this pickup tube so the clay doesn't stick and fall off of it. And what we want to do is just take a little piece of clay, Play-Doh, whatever you can get that's going to allow us to, to see what this distance is. We're going to want to put the gasket in place. This is just for testing. So, and what we're looking for is to have roughly a 1/4 inch. You need to have, that's pretty much with any engine, a 1/4 inch of clearance between the bottom of the pan and the pickup tube is going to get that job done. So you kind of just press down on that nice and tight, and we would lift that back up, see where we're at. I mean, you can literally measure that, but it's going to be about a 1/4 inch once we get the verniers out. If you need to adjust it at all, you can literally take a little block of wood and a rubber mallet. You can actually bend these down. It's kind of a little hack, but you don't have a ton of options here. You can try tweaking this a little. Sometimes you can pop that down a little bit to gain the little bit that you might need, 100 thousandths, which isn't a ton. So, but most importantly, you're gonna wanna make sure that you have a 1/4 inch of clearance between the bottom of the pickup tube and obviously the bottom of the pan. That'll be huge. The other thing that we want to make sure that we're paying attention to, you guys that got earlier LS1s or the truck crowd, this O-ring here is the thicker one. You'll see here that there's a little bit of a taper in here. You want to make sure that you have that O-ring on it. See how tight this fits on there? It's nice and snug. It's not loose. You're going to find that black O-ring, the thinner one, is going to be loose on there. That will cause it to suck air. You're going to have low pressure. You're going to cause you to take it all back apart again. So that's a very common mistake that a lot of people made. We've made it here 15, 20 years ago when we first started messing with these things. So we learned the hard way. We don't want you to learn the hard way. That is going to be the other thing there. After that, we are going to also focus on seals for this. So remember, the LS1 uses a Teflon seal. We typically like to use the factory seals. They're all Teflon. You do not want to oil this seal. If you oil it, you will ruin it. You will have a leak, which obviously creates a ton of work, pulling the harmonic balancer back off or pulling the engine out and changing your rear seal. So you want to put these on dry. It's most important to be dry with these. From there, after that, we are going to silicone at the back of this. So typically this whole area here will silicone all around the back because you've only got these two small bolts holding all this here. So you want to silicone on the block and the cover and then on the gasket again before you put that gasket on and tighten everything up. All the bolts will typically torque to 20 foot-pounds. All these bolts we get, you can get these from Fastenal. I mean, they're basically just a flange head metric bolt, 8mm, 6mm. These 8mm ones are 25 long. 6mm ones are usually right around 25 to 30 long, depending upon what you're doing. You can measure out your stock ones to get a reference. So I would do that, or ARP does sell full bolt kits if you want to go that route as well. It's a little more money to do it that way. But that pretty much sums up what's happening with the oil system, addressing the pickup tube heights, you stroker guys with making sure your windage trays are clearanced, this silicone that needs to be applied here in order to not have a leak. All these things we've seen from building engines and dyno testing stuff and sending engines out over the last 30 years to customers, about 20 years with these LSs. So again, things we've modified in our assembly procedure to make it easy for us as well as our customer. So we're going to go through what we're using for a lifter in all these LS builds when we're doing the short blocks. Typically, we are using an OE lifter. This lifter you can get through Comp Cams, you can get through Johnson, you can get through Elgin. The most important part of this lifter is this little tin shield. Okay, that is the lifter that is good. If you have a lifter that has a visual circlip, that lifter is known to fail. You never want to use that lifter. You want to make sure that any lifter you have has that tin shield. That's the one that has been reliable over the years and hasn't given us any problems. When we are installing these lifters, these are the buckets. You always want to replace these buckets. These come from GM. And when you get this brand new bucket, you want to make sure that you're drilling a hole using a 3/8 drill bit about 1.5 inches down. So you can see here we've drilled this. These are drain back holes. So that way that oil won't just fill up in here. It will actually drain back and get back into the sump. You can imagine that 16 of these holes, troughs here, will hold quite a bit of oil and it won't drain back properly. When we are done with that drilling and we install these lifters, we just want to go through and make sure we're putting a generous amount of oil on all the moving part of the lifter, this whole body, the roller, and then we basically will just take and dump these right in, all oiled up. We'll pop them right in. Once those are installed, we want to use these actual GM bolts. Notice there's a little step there that goes into the plastic that holds it in. And you're going to want to use a drop of blue Loctite on that. So just tighten them up with some blue Loctite. That will be the installation of the lifter, and it is very, very straightforward. And that's it. So that'll get you covered on installation of lifters. Next, we're going to go into installing the heads and everything you need to do there. So now we're going to talk about installing the cylinder heads. And these are the two most common gaskets that we use. So this is the GM gasket. This is the 6 liter 6.2. It's marked right on there. This gasket works great for all natural aspirated applications. We use it even up into 600 horsepower NA without any issues. Installation of this gasket, pretty simple. You got a front on these GM gaskets. Obviously the front will go towards the front. Most important part of these two holes here always want to be in the back on any gasket that you're installing. So we would just put this on dry. This would be pretty simple, just knocking that right on. You're ready to roll. You boosted guys that want to run Cometic, or any of the NA guys that want to use Cometic, no problem there. This gasket is marked on the front on both sides. Now these 4-bolt versions of these gaskets, they don't have directional. There's not a left and a right on them like the 6-bolt. So these gaskets can go on either side, but you just want to make sure that the front is always in the front, and that these two holes are open. So you'll notice here that this gasket, the front will be facing down. So that's the important thing. It's on the Cometic, doesn't necessarily have to have the front facing up. The main thing is these two holes are open in the back. The front will be facing down. But if you take and put this gasket on this side, the front will be facing up, the holes will be in the back. So just be mindful of that when you're installing these, because if you have these holes on the front, it's going to block coolant off and you're going to overheat immediately. So that will be a huge problem. The next thing, head bolts. So obviously ARP, we don't use anything but. I don't use any factory bolts. The ARP stuff is the way to go. They are reusable. You guys with the LQ9, early LQ9s, you're going to do a 134-3609. That's going to be the super long bolt with 4 of these shorter length on the ends. So then some of the later LQ9s do take this 3610, which is going to be all the same length main bolts. And then all the other blocks, LS2, 3, 7, LSX stuff, those are all going to be this 3610. So we'll use that. So that's pretty much the part numbers that you're going to want to use when it comes to the head bolts. Next, you always want to use this ARP lube when you're installing these. So we're going to want to make sure that we coat the threads. You don't have to go crazy, just the 5 or so threads. We're going to layer that with some ARP lube all the way around. But the important thing here, okay, per the ARP instructions, you want to lube underneath this washer. But see these little cut knurls here on the bottom of this washer? Do not lubricate that. Let's say 4 or 5 years ago, ARP changed this washer design. And if you lubricate that, in some cases, probably mostly in the aluminum blocks, you'll find yourself continuing to torque the bolt and it could rip the threads right out of the block. So you want to make sure that that is the dry side and those little cut lines are facing, those are going right on the aluminum part of the cylinder head. When we torque these, we are torquing them, we're actually putting the head on, which we'll do right now. And I'll show you exactly the procedure that we use for torquing these. So we put 2 bolts in the ends here and we just kind of get those right in the dowel so that kind of lines it up. That way you're not falling off. And then we'll throw all the bolts right in quickly. And we use a gun. You can use a speed wrench. Obviously you want to be gentle if you're using a gun. You don't want to just zap them right down, go nice and slow. So you can just any means of getting them down, and you want to get them all down and flush, just snug, if you will. And then the next step will be torquing them. So once we have them flush, we're going to end up torquing these to 35 and then 55 and then 75. So let's see, so that's all of those. Yeah, so next step will just be bringing these down smoothly. And the pattern that we're going to use is going to be from the center out. So I'll do this twice, you'll see it here and when we torque it. So we're just kind of going smoothly down and we'll just X out. So that way, going from the center, X, no particular pattern here, just bring the head down smoothly from the middle, Xing out. And then these little guys will go right in. Pop these in real quick. Now we're just going to show you, what we do to torque. So you'll see this pattern one more time, when we actually go through to torque this engine. So what we're going to do is, again, start from the middle. And this is just going to be, for the sake of the video, I'm only going to do the first step, which is 35 foot-pounds. So just starting with those 2 middle bolts and then just, again, no particular order, just kind of an X pattern out. That way we'll get everything down nice and smooth. And you can just kind of come over here. That will just that will get all of those. But the most important thing, that we always feel is like when you're done, you go to 55 next, 75 at the end. And then the best way to just ensure that you didn't miss anything is we just go right in order. Just right down the line in order just to make sure, all right, everything ended up at 75 foot-pounds and there's no issues, so that way, you won't be, worried that you didn't get a bolt. You've obviously double-checked everything in order. So that pretty much sets up everything there. After that, these little guys will torque to 25 foot-pounds, and you're done. I mean, that'll be simple. And then the next thing we're going to go into is the installation of the rocker arms and going through the push rod preload procedure. So that way you can get your push rod length right, make sure your preload's set, and we're not going to have any issues with noise or holding a valve. Let's talk about installing the rocker arms on your LS Chevy. So if you're at home building your own engine and installing the valve train, you're going to have to be mindful of something that's called push rod preload. So with these LS engines, in this case here, we're using an OE style lifter that you saw earlier in the video. And we're going to need to set up push rod preload. So there's a procedure that you need to use in order to get this done right. We have found this is what I'm going to show you here is going to be a good procedure for doing it at home. Okay, if you don't have the tools to do it, which is going to be a magnetic based dial indicator to measure it perfectly, this procedure here will get the job done and allow your engine to run without making a bunch of noise, or the other case would be, not turn over and have compression. So first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to rotate this engine over until we have both lifters, at their dwell position. So you'll see them, one go up, one go down, and once we get to the back side of the lobe, they're both going to be in their down position. So in this case, we'll start off with the exhaust rocker. So what we're doing here is we're going to find, get this down, get us to the point where we're finding, a 0 lash point. Right now you can see we move it up and down, we got some lash. We'll come forward here until that lash is canceled. I usually like to just double check it, back up a little. All right, I know I got some lash. Then I'll go forward a little bit until I got that lash canceled out. So once we have obtained 0 lash, we're taking our ratchet, in this case the speed handle, we'll set it up at about 12 o'clock position, and we're going to rotate it over until it just gets snug. You don't want to torque it. That's going to stretch the bolt. It's not going to be a preload. So we got this snug. In this case, it's about 3/4 of a turn of preload. So that's our measurement. So for a cast iron block, we want to keep the range between 3/4 to 1 full turn. That's an acceptable range to keep the valve train quiet. And from there, you would do the same procedure, checking the intake. Now, we do recommend, at home, you just go through and spend the extra time, check all 16 of these, make sure you're in the range. Remember, it's not fine-tuned. This is hydraulic. It's something that you could be a little, less than a half or a little more than a half. It's going to be fine. But if you are a whole quarter past the half, then that's, you're going to need to, change the push rod length in order to change your preload, because unlike an earlier small block Chevy where you'd have a stud with an adjusting nut, this requires you, if you need to change the preload, you're changing the length of the push rod. So if you needed to add more preload to it, in this case, if you started off with a stock length push rod, which would be 7/400, and you needed to add some, you would go to a longer push rod, which would be like a 7/450, and you'd recheck and see where you're at. Most cases with these factory blocks, you're going to find that the stock length usually gets the job done depending upon what cam. Now, guys that have an aluminum block, there's a bunch of extra expansion in that aluminum block. So that preload, you're going to run between 1 full turn and a turn and a half, using the same exact procedure, just making sure that you're falling between that range. So do not treat it like a cast iron block. That's not going to work out. One of the other things that we do when we're done, getting the preload, adjusted, we're going to take this extreme pressure lube or something similar to it. Make sure you coat all of the tips of the push rods and the tips of the rock rounds all the way across. That way we have a little bit of lubrication up there before, full oil gets to that point on the startup. The other thing is when we're putting the bolt in. Now remember, all aftermarket LS heads that are CNC ported. You're going to notice that that rocker bolt hole breaks through to the intake port. So you need to silicone that bolt in order for there not to be a vacuum leak. So if you forget to silicone that, you could have a vacuum leak where it'll be pulling oil into that intake port, which really isn't a good thing to have. So after that, that should get you all set. One other thing we wanted to mention is when you get that silicone on there and you torque that bolt, it's going to be torqued to 25 foot-pounds. And you're going to want to torque all these 25 foot-pounds. You're going to want to rotate the engine over once or twice and just go back through with the torque wrench and check everything in order. That way you can ensure you've missed nothing and that they're all at 25 foot-pounds. And at this point, you're ready to put the valve covers on and get it to the next step, get it fired up. So we're going to talk about installing the intake manifold on our LS engine. So here we got our Golden Engine LS3 CNC ported heads. And we have the Fast 102 LSXR intake manifold. This intake manifold's great. Flows great amount of air. When you're installing this intake manifold, you got to be mindful that they do not give you the intake gasket. So you're going to need to buy this intake gasket part number separately. When you put this intake on, we're going to want to make sure that these O-rings are firmly pressed into the intake manifold. Make sure they're in there nice. Drop the intake on. Now, these LS engines, the bolts holes go into oil. So you need to make sure that you're putting sealer on all of the bolts. So just a little bit of silicone wrapped around on the threads, drop all the bolts in. Now, when we go to tighten this intake manifold up, we want to make sure that we're starting from, let's say, the middle, okay, and start to lightly bring them out. You're going to end up, it'll be at the end, it'll end up at 89 inch-pounds, which is about 7.5 foot-pounds. So just make sure you slowly torque from center out until you reach that point. That'll get everything tightened up so you have no leaks, no problems. One other side note is if you're using one of these, this is a GM, water crossover, or even any of the Motion Racework stuff, you want to get this stuff on before you put the intake on, because as you can see, it's going to be next to impossible to get all that in there and tightened up with the intake manifold on. After that, the only other things, just be careful with your injectors. Make sure you put just a little bit of light oil. That way everything, fits in. You don't tear an O-ring. From there, next we are ready to get this engine primed and ready for the dyno. So let's talk about installing the damper on the LS Chevy. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to use a block of wood and a hammer. That's the old school way, and that's just going to guarantee to damage something. First step you're going to want to do is you're going to remember earlier in the video we talked about not lubricating the seal. That's a Teflon timing seal, so you want to make sure that goes on dry. On the inside diameter of the damper, you want to use a little never seize, so when you're pressing this on, it doesn't try to gall. And then what we use here is actually this Summit Racing tool, which you can see the part number here, and a fairly inexpensive tool, and it is this will drive it on. So this is the best way to install this with an actual installer that's made for this engine. One of the other key things you're going to need, which I do not have the part number for, but this tool here, this basically locks, you install this on the back of the crank, it hinges off the dowel, and this locks it up, so when you're installing this damper, you don't find yourself, the engine spinning over. You don't want to make sure you drive this all the way until it stops. Make sure it's on, because if you don't, your ribs on your belt won't line up properly. We always use the ARP bolt. So this bolt, you're going to want to put a little never seize on it. You want to put a little silicone underneath the washer portion of the head, and then torque that to 230 foot-pounds. So having that locked out tool that holds the back of the engine is going to be 100% needed when you try to torque this to 230. That is all you're going to need to know to install that properly and make sure you're good to go. Now let's talk about priming the oil system on the LS Chevy. So unlike the early small block Chevys, which had a distributor in the back where you could stick a drill down in there and prime it manually, if you will, these engines you need to air prime. So, and most people don't have an air primer at home. So again, it is super important. You can't just pull the coil wire and crank it over. You're going to end up, running the bearings dry. So the right way to do it is to use an air primer, and we typically go through this port here. This is the main oil port. We stick a fitting in here, and we're able to blow oil into it. So this primer, this is a relic. This was from my grandfather's shop back in the 50s and 60s. He was a race engine builder that built flathead Ford racing engines and worked on all the local town vehicles, and he built this from scratch way back. It's one of the only things I have from his shop from back in the day. We use it here for 30 years now. We've been using this thing. So what this does is you pour oil, you pull this cap, pour a quart of oil in here, all right, pop that cap on, keep this valve shut, and then what we do is we stick air, and so we stick an air fitting on the side, and it fills it up with air pressure. We usually put it to about 40 psi. Then you would go through, you would hook this on here, and you would open this valve, and through this clear hose, well, used to be clear, but now it's a little stained over the years, but you can see the oil actually going through, and when you're done because you start to see some air bubbles, and then you can basically shut the valve, pull it off. And what it's done at this point is it's blown a full quart of oil into the engine, and it's basically pressurized everything. So now you have oils in all the galleys, oil are right at all the main bearings, rod bearings. In some cases, it'll get oil up into the lifter. It doesn't typically fill the lifter all the way, but you'll basically be ready at this point to start the engine with confidence that it's not going to run dry. So these are all the problems that we've seen customers have over the years. Hopefully this will help you guys be successful in your builds at home. So if you have any questions, just feel free to give a call or shoot us an email. We'd be happy to help you. And also keep in touch. We're going to have a bunch more LS videos down the line. We're going to be doing some videos on dynoing and tuning with the Holley Terminator X system. So stay in touch.